NVIDIA has flooded the market. 11 of the first 16 GPUs on Newegg are NVIDIA GeForce cards. On Amazon, page 1 of the computer graphics card category shows 24 NVIDIA to only 10 AMD. At Micro Center, 77% of the first 96 GPUs listed are all NVIDIA. At Best Buy, there's more AMD representation up front, but the suggested GPU filters on the left are exclusively for the NVIDIA 40 series. Even Walmart has NVIDIA GPUs in 25 of its first page slots versus just 2 for AMD. 2. And most recently, AMD's own earnings report declared a 48% decline in its gaming-related segment sales, including Radeon graphics. And so we come back to that intro, which is that it feels like NVIDIA has flooded the market, and this is a feeling we've had for a while now, but we wanted to try and put some fact-based research behind it to see if it was just a bias from exposure or if that's actually true. And there's some obvious factors in there, like market share, but there's a lot of interesting data we could dig through to try and understand the grander strategy of both AMD and NVIDIA and do something different for us, which is ignore the performance and look at a whole lot of other numbers instead. Today we'll be talking about these charts we've painstakingly put together showing NVIDIA's launch cadence and the embattlement between AMD and NVIDIA. We'll also talk about the implications it has on AMD and Intel in the consumer GPU market. And because some of this is getting into sort of the marketing psychology, it's an imperfect collection of data. But we think there's enough here to try and better understand the story of what's happened in the GPU market. Before that, this video is brought to you by Thermal Grizzly and the CryoSheet graphene pads. CryoSheet pads are made to be easily applicable for a thermal interface and completely avoid paste dryout because it's not paste. It makes them particularly useful for long service life systems with minimal maintenance. They come in multiple sizes for suitability on the most common laptops and desktop CPUs, and you can learn more at the Thermal Grizzly Cryo Sheets at the link in the description below. NVIDIA is stuffing the market with SKU upon SKU of video card to the point that retailers, it seems like, almost have to try to put AMD up there in any kind of balanced way with NVIDIA. And with retailers, a lot of money exchanges hands too to even get those top slots. That's a whole different story for another time. And Intel obviously doesn't show up that much. Intel only really has one generation right now, whereas AMD's been there for, well, as long as it's been relevant, at least anytime recently. First, let's just see if the feeling that NVIDIA is more prevalent is valid beyond the obvious of market share. According to the Video Cards GPU database, there are 1,091 different partner cards for the NVIDIA GeForce 40 series alone versus a measly 162 variants for the AMD Radeon 7000 series. Even allowing for cataloging error or missing a couple, that gulf is massive. NVIDIA's 30 series had an even crazier 1,489 models versus 335 for AMD 6000 series. Now, a few of the entries on both sides are marked as having never launched. There's a couple that are kind of duplicates. There's a lot of them that are very small deviations in clock spec, for example. So the real number might be a little bit lower, but the fundamental point remains, which is that despite how many actual GPU SKUs exist, NVIDIA clearly has more partner presence. It's inarguable. It's just fact. The only thing that's up for debate is maybe the specific number. And that means it can flood the retail listings, even if it were to have fewer generational SKUs. We're going to use the phrase self-fulfilling prophecy a lot in this piece because that's what this is. They sell more, so it makes sense that partners would make more versions of the card that sells more. They can segment it more. They can try to add different features to compete with the other partners who are flooding the market in their own way. But even beyond this, there's just something about NVIDIA's presence in the market and in the PC space in particular for DIY where it makes it feel like NVIDIA is involved at every step of the way. And media is a part of that, which means that we have unique insights to it. We're part of the media covering NVIDIA, AMD, Intel, and everyone else. So we decided to collate every embargo we could remember for both AMD and NVIDIA for its most recent GPU launches. Went through emails, pulled all the official press correspondence, the sort of special advance emails we get about a new product coming out, and we pulled out the release dates and the embargo dates. Now, we're not sure if we got every single one, but after scouring the inbox, this is what we came up with. NVIDIA had about 19 separate embargoes for its RTX 40 launches, depending on how you count the canceled embargoes and the unlaunched video card. These 19 or so embargoes surrounded 9 products. So again, AMD had about 10 embargoes, 9 without the GRE, and 8 if you ignore the canceled 7600 unboxing embargo. So these 8 to 10 surround 7 products, or in other words, as a ratio, NVIDIA averaged 2.1 news or review embargoes per product, while AMD averaged between 1.14 and 1.4 per product. None of this is inherently evil or untoward, but it does tell us about the strategy of the two companies, where NVIDIA has clearly determined that whether or not the world agrees with it, its information is interesting enough that it can disseminate it across a longer time scale, across just as many or pretty close to as many products, and it does so carefully enough that it's able to warrant additional separate releases of information. Now, this is key because in media, for us to even consider a secondary embargo for a similar product, there has to be something significant. So again, even without the partner embargoes, NVIDIA is slowing its outflow of information to spread over multiple events and span a longer length of time. AMD seems to more regularly combine multiple products or announcements into one embargo. You can see that in our table. This is a key strategic difference. And so by spanning a longer stretch of time, NVIDIA is able to get repeat exposure and build familiarity with its brand and with that new generation of products. And this is important because the familiarity is a key marketing play that kind of gets at the roots of human psychology. Now, we're not psychologists, but one part of this is called the mere exposure effect. In general terms, the more a person is exposed to something, the more familiar they are with it. Makes sense. But what's interesting is it also suggests that the more they like it. The Wikipedia entry says, quote, "In the advertising world, the mere exposure effect suggests that consumers need not think about advertisements. Simple repetition is enough to make a memory trace in the consumer's mind and unconsciously affect their consuming behavior," end quote. So it does seem like the mere exposure effect is a thing that can be leveraged in selling a product. And in this capacity, NVIDIA is targeting that angle of marketing seemingly more than AMD. But that exposure goes beyond the news cycle, and it does become sort of a perpetual motion machine. For starters, there are literally just more NVIDIA cards out there in use. The Steam hardware survey isn't the perfect data tool, nothing in here really is, but it's useful for this. Adding together the percent share of the top 10 DX12 GPUs from each NVIDIA and AMD gives us 36% for NVIDIA and only 6% for AMD. Zooming out to the entire data set puts NVIDIA at about 77% market share and AMD at about 16%. If you don't like Steam hardware survey, there's also John Petty Research, or JPR, which recently had NVIDIA 80% market share for DGPUs in Q2 of 2023 and AMD at 17%. No matter which way you count it, the ratio is extremely in NVIDIA's favor. And this phenomenon of more exposure in general doesn't exist only on YouTube and Steam, of course, because you also see it at places like retailers. Most customers buy NVIDIA cards in general, which naturally makes the retailer stock more of what customers want, whether they're digital or physical. This leads to reinforcing the purchasing bias. If an undecided or uninformed customer walks into a store or goes online to buy a GPU, and they see a wall of green boxes but only a few red ones, there's going to be a higher chance of them actually buying an NVIDIA card instead of an AMD one. That could be as simple as the literal probability in a random die roll, or something deeper, like increased trust in the more prevalent brand. Maybe they've had a good or a bad experience with one. But either way, there's more NVIDIA boxes, and that plays in NVIDIA's favor. This is also contributed to by that huge difference in partner models we saw. So some of this stuff is sort of the obvious, well, bigger company gets bigger, not really a surprise in the way the system works. But there is more to it than the psychology of exposure and visibility. The next section we're getting into is some hard data. So this section will roughly count the GPU launches and note the prices. We're going back to about 2009, 2010 era. We're going to be talking just gaming GPUs in almost all of these charts. There's one chart that has Titans in here as well, along with AMD's then super high-end, maybe not gaming cards. But for the most part, we're looking at just gaming. Consider this kind of chunk as us defining a methodology. Just like we would with testing methodology, we have to define how we chose data. Because if you look at it, there are thousands, of video card SKUs, including partner models and everything, over the last 14 years or so. And even if you just look at the actual literal GPU, there's probably in the hundreds of them. And so we had to narrow it down. So we went all the way back to NVIDIA GeForce 400 series. We looked at the then freshly acquired ATI AMD Radeon HD 6000 series as well. And this is tough to count because there's so many qualifiers and small re-releases, refreshes, things like that. So imposing some rules and being open that it's impossible to do this perfectly or in a scientifically controlled way like a benchmark, we have some judgment calls. First, the question of what constitutes a gaming GPU or what constitutes a series. For this, we only counted GPUs that we'd consider to be a worldwide launch that would include North America. We're in this market, so selfishly it gave us a good anchor point. That means we are not counting China-only launches, like the RTX 4090D, for example, the GTX 1065 gigabyte. That was for the sort of PC cafe market. We ignored OEM exclusive variants as well, whether or not they were in North America. That also includes ignoring alternate die versions of the same named video card when the specs were cut down to the same level as the original. We compiled this from multiple sources. We used TechPowerUp's GPU database, Wikipedia, video cards, and various written media articles for some of the information on legacy products that's more sparse. Despite the multiple days of time it took to put all this together, it's possible that a couple of the data points are off by a little bit. We mostly stuck with TechPowerUp and Wikipedia to give us 2 data points for everything to just vet it at least once, and that should help keep things somewhat consistent. We're happy with this all together. It was a hell of a process. Took Jeremy days of work to put this together. But being transparent, this is something that can't be done in a perfect way. So anyway, let's dive into it. Here's the first table. We have the name of each generation, how many cards it had, both with and without Titans, and the dates of the first and last GPU launches of the generation. We used those dates to calculate the duration of each generation, which is between the first to last launch within one generation. We also counted the time between generations, which is between the first launch of the generation to the first launch of the following generation. Remember that we're ignoring certain devices, so again, the 1065 gigabyte isn't in here. Starting with NVIDIA, the duration of generations has gone up over time, with the most extreme examples due to late releases and stragglers after the next generation has already launched. The GeForce 20 and 16 series, which we bundled together due to coexisting at the same time, being the same base architecture, spanned a staggering 45 months. The latest addition was the GTX 1630 in June of 2022, an absolute garbage GPU that launched to zero acclaim and left a sad scorch mark at the end of the GTX lineage. But ignoring that card, some quick and interesting points. The GTX 900 series was abnormally low on card count at 6 to 7, depending on how you count them. It lasted 17 months. The last 17-month series was the thermally plagued GTX 400 Fermi lineup. The GTX 600 series had 13 cards, but lasted even shorter than the 900 series. The RTX 30 and 20 series lasted the longest to date, even if you take the 16 series out. The generation-to-generation gap has slowly increased with time across what we've plotted here. This chart shows each GPU release per generation. The x-axis is time, and the y-axis only serves to separate the generation into its own row. This makes it really easy to see how NVIDIA clustered the launches in each gen of product. And again, some launch dates may be off on the precision just due to some conflicting historical information between sources for especially those older cards. Late additions also stick out, like the GTX 1630 halfway into 2022, the recently launched 3056 gigabyte in February 2024. You can see that NVIDIA tends to have at least one last card significantly trailing each generation, and it is almost always in the low end or extreme low end of what would be available at that current date. This follows a large gap between the main launches. What's interesting is that NVIDIA appears to be shifting its strategy. We think it is trying to have more concurrent generations or products available at the same time across multiple generations of architecture. What we also find interesting is how legacy launches tended to be more tightly clustered, both internal to their own generation and from gen to gen. The more recent generations drag out for longer. This highlights the 900 series as the counterpoint back when GPU launches were simpler, fewer, and with few stragglers. Back to the table, the time between NVIDIA generations has generally increased, but it has been in a fairly stable 2-year cadence since the 10 series. It's a lot slower than back in the old days, even without counting the hastily refreshed GeForce 400 series that got replaced the same year it came out. That was a bad one. For the 50 series, looking back to a news story we ran from Hardware Lux in June 2023, NVIDIA may be planning to wait to launch the 50 series, marked here as Ada Lovelace Next, until first quarter 25. That means stretching the gap to at least 27 months after the 40 series launch. However, newer rumors point toward a potential 5080 at the end of this year, which would put it closer to around 24 months. But again, the thing we've really noticed just over the last few generations is that there's more overlap, where even though the last generation is replaced or being replaced by the current one, whatever that is, it looks like NVIDIA is keeping that prior generation around for longer in the lower end. So you saw that with the 3060, for example, the 3060 Ti, the 3050, where for the longest time, they were filling a gap where the 40 series didn't exist, and in the case of the 3050, that's still true. You also saw this with the 16 series, with the 20 series, where there's more overlap at the very end of that prior generation through kind of midlife almost of the current one. By comparison, AMD is much less consistent with the duration of its generations, to the point that the Radeon RX 400 series had all of its launches within the span of about a month, which is actually kind of insane to think about. There's no repeat exposure here. It's almost a disposable launch for them. Looking at the Wikipedia table of Radeon 400 series cards, you can see that there were more than 3, just like there were more than the other ones we looked at, but they fall outside the criteria, like many of the others. These included the China-only RX 470D, the OEM-only cards that didn't appear in the PC DIY discussion in any meaningful way, like the RX 430, and official discrete launches were the 460, the 470, and the RX 480, of course. These had variations in memory capacity, but no change to the CU configuration between 4 and 8 gigabytes for those. The longest on the list is the RX 6000 series, spanning 35 months of launches, thanks to the RX 6750 GRE that launched in October 2023 in other markets. But this is on the list because it recently became available as a worldwide launch officially. NVIDIA's most similar to this was the 700 series, also at 35 months. Its 30 series was 40 months, with 20 and 16 at 45. Switching to the overtime plot shows us how the bulk of AMD's generational launch happens more tightly together. The Radeon 300 series and the Vega or RX 500 series had late stragglers, as did the RX 6000 series. But AMD's best cards tend to be at the start of the generation, and aside from an occasional refresh, like an RX 590, there's little follow-up other than an occasional weekly marketed refresh card. Compared to NVIDIA, there's less overlap across generations as well. AMD seems to keep a tidier product availability where it more thoroughly kills or sells through the prior generation before making a switch to the next one. Whether that's strategy or just they ran out of cards, we can't really know. NVIDIA seems to be switching to the opposite strategy from that, and that's a key strategic difference. However, it looks like AMD might also be starting to change its methods to be more in line with what we're seeing from NVIDIA, where the 6000 and 7000 series handoff was different from the rest of the trend. The 6000 series has persisted late into the 7000 series lifecycle. This may not have been intentional, as both NVIDIA and AMD overpurchased during the COVID boom, but if it is intentional, that would be maybe setting them up in a similar situation to NVIDIA, where now the prior generation becomes the low end. The time between AMD's generations has also varied, but without the same general climb that NVIDIA's had. Overall, AMD's generations come slightly more frequently than NVIDIA's. Now, this is a whole different discussion entirely, but there have been a few key name changes over the years. NVIDIA's was GTX and RTX, AMD's was basically every launch. And that contributes to the marketing, where you have switches between the HD 1000 series. Of course, there was an ATI handoff in there. They had the 100 series, 400, 500. They had the 300 series before, but the RX signifier changed over time as well. And they had Vega. They had moved to the 5000 series, 6000. And so it's not as consistent, which also contributes to some of this. But let's take a quick look at how many different cards have been launched in each generation. So same disclosure here, treat this like disclosing limitations of testing methodology, where it's tough to count these cards perfectly consistently because the vendors are not consistent in what dictates a new card or a new generation. Sometimes they use new naming for old products, things like that. So it's not necessarily a bad thing, or if it is, we're not talking about that right now, but what we are talking about is a span of 14 years, and so their decisions have changed on that. This chart strips all nuance and leaves only the launches per vendor. We definitely see more density from NVIDIA here. There isn't an overall trend for NVIDIA. Most generations have 10 to 13 GPUs, with some outliers like the 900 series, for example. AMD has generally gone down in the number of cards per generation since the HD days, as back then, half the lineup would be rebadged to GPUs from previous architectures. Though AMD did revive this approach for the RX 500 series. The Radeon RX 400 and the RX 5000 series in particular were low on different GPUs. The latter, even with the forgotten Radeon 7 bundled in, was still low. Narrowing down to generations that started in 2016 onward shows a recent difference between NVIDIA and AMD, starting at the GeForce 10 series and counting until now. NVIDIA has 54 GPUs that qualify for our list making, while the Radeon 400 series, to now, has only 38. And remember, again, they had some weird ones in there, like Vega, and at one point there was the Fury lineup as well. Now, the perception of this objective imbalance is only exacerbated by the huge difference in the number of board partner models that we mentioned earlier, which has a multiplying effect. But let's expand the data to a scatter plot. This one includes some Titans as well, and we also have Vega Frontier Edition in here. The x-axis is still time, but the y-axis is now the launch price. This chart isn't adjusted for inflation, that's next. You can see the faint trend lines show a greater increase over time for NVIDIA than AMD. Even without inflation adjustment, the two relative to each other shows that NVIDIA is increasing at a faster rate on average than AMD. This chart makes it harder to discern launch frequency, but it helps us visually peel apart those simultaneous launches. The vertical clusters represent when AMD or NVIDIA put out multiple new GPUs at the same time. It's interesting how you can see some head-to-head launches at times, like one was clearly targeting the other's new device. One example is 2011, where both NVIDIA and AMD had a card in the $700 range. Another 2011 revelation is AMD flooding the sub-$200 market and outflanking NVIDIA's sparse offerings. We see head-to-head rivalry again in 2015, where NVIDIA and AMD both have about a $640 card or so. You can see this back in 2010 as well, where NVIDIA launched two cards in the sub-$300 class, followed a few months later by AMD in the same two price brackets. They're clearly responding to each other. 2018 was bizarre. NVIDIA fought no one for new attention, or at least very little until the end of the year. One key takeaway is that AMD seems to cluster around a particular price point for each generation, like they're targeting that heavily. In 2023, we see heavy clustering in the $400 to $600 range, stacking in a big way against NVIDIA's few new options in that price range. NVIDIA, meanwhile, seems to occupy more total price points with at least one device per price point. It's a big difference in approach. Here's the inflation-adjusted version. Since all numbers move with inflation, it follows that the trend lines are basically the same here. They just change the start point. But this helps reset the scale to normalize for the value of the US dollar. We can't read too much into the trend lines since they get distorted by GPUs like an RTX 4090, but they still show an upward trajectory for both companies, with NVIDIA's again increasing at a faster rate. As we wrap up with some light analysis here, I think my good friend Gordon Ma-Un put it the best.
Internet, you will disagree, you will piss and moan in the comments all day, you will cry about it, scream about it, go on Twitter and Reddit, and and then you go to buy your NVIDIA card. And the internet, because I know you right now, is like, yeah, this is like, I only care about value, you know, F you, NVIDIA. You know, what's up with the prices?
Hey, Gordon.
Oh, I'm sorry.
We're in a restaurant. And as usual, he's absolutely right. And if you haven't seen that video, that is one of my all-time favorite discussions I've ever filmed. We'll link that below. Please go watch it. Gordon's great in there. Former Maximum PC, and these days he's at PC World. But AMD is present in every discussion of value, and that's good. It's a balanced market and discussion that way. But presence outside of that discussion, like actual use in systems, actual presence on shelves, it's clearly lower. There have been points in the past, actually recently, where it feels like NVIDIA has a video card available for every $50 that a consumer is willing to spend, leading to them cornering just about every part of the market. The only question is who has the better value at that price point and if AMD is present. And of course now Intel's entering the discussion. We left them out of this because this is historical and they haven't been around for most of it. Now AMD, in those times where NVIDIA has been around every $50, depending on the generation you look at, it starts to space out. AMD might be every $100, every $200, with what feels like fewer launches, or at least launches that are more focused on a smaller total range of price points. Having more overall GPUs plus staggering the launches puts NVIDIA in the headlines, and stretching the most important details in a way that actually makes sense to segment embargoes from a media perspective also keeps them in the headlines. Again, not inherently a good or evil play, but it's a different way that they're playing the game. NVIDIA appears more frequently in articles online, whether that's business media or tech media, on more store shelves, in more digital slots on a retail site, and in more games and advertising. It's everywhere. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy of continually reinforcing the company's presence in the minds of consumers. And a lot of that is because they launch a lot of products, and that's a key factor to the strategy. They can afford to do that. This is another instance of the mere exposure effect. Seeing NVIDIA more often than AMD reinforces with consumers a bias that is either already established or is one being built. This is particularly true for customers who don't watch videos like this every day, consumers who are buying a GPU every 5 or 6 years and don't stay tuned into it. In those instances especially, brand credibility matters a lot. You can see this also with companies like Dell or HP, where the consumer might be buying a computer for their small business, their flower shop, whatever it may be, where they just need something that works. That company hasn't screwed them particularly bad in the past. They buy that company again. So NVIDIA benefits from that. Now, we saw a comment recently that read something along the lines of, I don't think AMD keeps NVIDIA's prices down. I think NVIDIA pulls AMD's prices up, which is an interesting commentary. And I thought that was a really sort of prescient comment, because it may be the case. AMD is trending up, but it's trending up at a slower pace than NVIDIA. But AMD is also lacking in total launches. It lacks that sort of total market blitz strategy that NVIDIA takes, where it's just trying to capture every segment and keep that attention going as long as it can. And it makes AMD look less strategic or less structured with each launch. Now, we're not sure if that's an intentional difference of strategy, meaning they've thought about it and they want to do it that way, or if it's more of a byproduct of AMD lacking the sufficient funding, the sufficient maybe technology or architectural changes to allow them to diversify the product stack, or to allow them to introduce a flagship super high-end card, for example. The end result is an appearance of lower presence, and that creates a cycle for AMD. NVIDIA comes across to the average consumer as bigger, more strategic or plotting, and more aggressive than its competitors. And after all, the Latin word NVIDIA, the company's namesake, has an interesting definition with plenty of aggressive modern synonyms like grudge, spite, and malice. Maybe that's reading too far into things, but we assume the founders picked the name for a reason. That's not to say we believe that AMD's presence in the GPU market is doomed. If AMD suddenly started to put out GPUs that beat NVIDIA's in performance at better prices at multiple points of the product stack, with and without ray tracing, then naturally consumers would start to go the other way. But even then, it might be a slow shift, as AMD would also have to earn trust from mainstream users or mainstream businesses. It'd also have to undo, and is undoing, years of damage from terrible drivers and massive driver issues, which, even though mostly resolved now, will still leave an impact in consumer memory for years. You look at the CPU market, and Intel got lazy. They sat on their technology, and they tried to ride the fact that people bought Intel because it's the safe option, it's worked, it's a stable platform. But obviously that got chipped away, and AMD Ryzen came out and kicked Intel in the ass. We don't think that NVIDIA will do the same thing as Intel, though. We don't think they're the type of company, they behave too differently to just rest like that. It's possible, but it really doesn't seem like that's NVIDIA's way. We also think that AMD really needs to go after some insane Halo tier performance GPUs at the consumer-friendly price tag to really take a shot at humbling NVIDIA's penchant for expensive flagships. But it might not be that easy. It either physically is incapable of doing that with the current generation of technology, or it has made a decision not to. Maybe something like not being able to burn the wafer allocation on a lower yield, larger die, when they could use it on something like their Zen CPUs, their server CPUs. But we think the power of a Halo product is undeniable at this point. People look at something like an RTX 4090, they see its power, and then they buy whatever they can afford below it. It's an unsophisticated approach to buying hardware, and a lot of us would probably like to think we're better than that. But that is how a lot of buyers behave. You see it in every industry, cars as an example. AMD recently reported that gaming revenue for the first quarter was down 48% year over year. This was in part due to lower semi-custom revenue from gaming consoles or handhelds, in addition to lower PC GPU sales, but AMD doesn't distinguish between the two. Its executive vice president, though, indicated that it's going to get worse. Quote, "We actually think the second half will be lower than first half." That's basically how we're looking at this year for the gaming business. And that is very concerning because the second half is where the money is. That's where everyone gambles on making the most sales, third and fourth quarter. But as much as we'd all like to think the domineering largest company in any space, like NVIDIA here, would act benevolently and in a consumer-friendly manner from its position of dominance, that's not really how the system works. And it ultimately falls to AMD and Intel and competitors, not to the one in the lead, to put up a strong enough fight to try and keep that competition to win over customers across the entire span of pricing. And it's just an uphill battle versus such an entrenched opposition like NVIDIA. That's it for this one. It was a really fun and interesting video. Like we said, this is not performance driven. There's not even necessarily a conclusion. This whole thing started because Jeremy and I were talking and the topic came up of it feels like NVIDIA is so much more present, and it's not just in market share, which we all know is higher. There's something else there. And so we wanted to try and explore what that was and if there was any facts around to back that up, and it appears there are. So anyway, fun video. Let us know what you think. An imperfect approach, but the result is in some ways pretty revealing, like the pricing trend, for example. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more. Go to store.gamersnexus.net to grab a shirt like this one, or patreon.com/gamersnexus if you'd like to throw us a few bucks regularly to help fund these types of videos. And we'll see you all next time.